This is an education. And being an education, it's a learning process, but it's pragmatic. That is to say, there's no plan which we have to follow. The 50-page handout, the outline, is not so much a plan to follow, but is an indication of druthers. If you notice, one of the qualities in this education, in this learning, is to just simply begin where we have the most traction, where we can literally get a foothold on our learning process. We begin with taking a walk from where we live. And the very first thing to do that we talked about last week at the first session, and which would have been done in the regular course of events during this past week, but you can double up starting today, looking towards the third Saturday next week. Sometime during this next week, if you have not already taken a walk consciously from wherever you live, then do that. And the follow-up to it is to take a second walk with what is called an indexing factor. That is to say, taking a single natural image, earth, air, fire, and water, if you have nothing else. Take one of those, take fire, and take the walk again, exactly as you did in the first walk. Only carry with you this indexing image and try to notice the events of the walk now colored or toned or changed by this indexing image. These two walks, the simple walk in a circumambulation beginning where you live, around your neighborhood, and back to the house again, and taking that second walk with the indexing image, that pair of walks is the beginning for this education. If you notice, our education begins with a 3-month section, 12 weeks, called Nature. And nature is actually the only base upon which we can begin and have any kind of assurance that we're going anywhere real, that we have begun anywhere significant, that our activity has meaning which can be later on brought out, distilled, as it were. These two walks form a pair, and the differential between the two elements of the pair, I almost said prayer, hopefully that people coming in late will quickly take their seats and disturb us the least. These two walks as a pair will have a differential of a single indexing image, and it'll be a natural image. This was the way in which all great wisdom traditions in antiquity taught. That is to say, the occurrence of a natural continuum was unnoticeable until we introduce something into that continuum. That is to say, let me put it even simpler. If we are a part of a flow of nature, which is complete, and we are completely submerged in that complete flow, there is no way to notice that we are in that flow. For example, in an interview one time, Carl Jung was asked about what he thought psychologically about the birth trauma. And he reminded the interviewer, he said, "We cannot know that. For we do not know anyone who was not born. We would have to know someone who did not go through birth trauma to know what a birth trauma was. And just in this way, a natural continuity. When man was a part of nature completely, there was no way to notice that he was natural. There was no way to reflect upon, no reason to reflect upon the fact that he was in a natural flow. The French anthropological thinker from the 1930s and 40s, who was very influential for Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, Mircea Eliade, a whole range of people, a man named Lucien Levy-Bruhl, wrote an influential little book called How Natives Think. And the term that he used in that book, using the English pronunciation of the French phrase, was mystical participation. That primordial man was so much a part of nature that it was like a mystical participation in nature, and there was no way to differentiate for himself, no way to notice that there was anything to notice, simply was a part of the process. In pairing up action and changing one image of the second action is like putting a finger in a stream, and right away you begin to get the swirls around the finger. By putting one image different in a pair of actions is the simplest, most basic way to observe the beginnings of the whole complication known as education. The whole need to know, the whole curiosity involved in realizing that there is a lot to know. There is a lot to find out, that one needs to put an endeavor into process and carry it through. All of this is contingent on discovering that one can be taken out of the natural participation to the extent initially of just one image. So our pair of walks is actually not a simple exercise, or one should say it is simple, but it's not sophomoric. It has a great deal of meaning. It indicates to us that nature yields naturally to another season of development. And that second season of development will be ritual. So our education will move from nature to ritual. And the first 6 months of this education will be 3 months in nature and 3 months in ritual. And what we will discover in this first 6 months is that there are no objects in nature whatsoever. Let me put it stronger, that existence does not occur in nature. That existence is a function of ritual and is not a property of nature. And we talked last week about the subtleness of the ancient Chinese in the I Ching, one of our initial books that we take a look at. Take a look at in a paired way. Pairing books forestalls jumping to conclusions egotistically, thinking that we do understand when it's not an object of trying to jump to conclusions, but simply to appreciate. So we pair textbooks together. The ancient Chinese, 5,000 years ago, in the I Ching, understood that nature has a Tao, and that Tao has a zero quality. So that our education begins, like a wisdom tradition should, with a zero quality, not nondescriptness, not a vacuum, but a zero quality, a zero base. So that when we get to existence, when we get to ritual, we can assign that a value of 1. And the Chinese term for that value of oneness was Te. And so one of the most basic books in all of the world is called the Tao Te book. Ching is the Chinese word for book, and it's called Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, which is one of the most useful books in world history. And in fact, we sum up the 12 weeks of nature by a 13th week outside of the 12-week set and use the Tao Te Ching as an interface. What does it interface? The Tao Te Ching will be an interval, an articulating interval, interfacing the 12 weeks on nature with the 12 weeks on ritual. So that the Tao Te Ching will be like a pivot. Nature will make a frame of reference. The Tao Te Ching will be the pivot, and ritual will be the door that will go in that frame. But until the door goes in the frame, we will not know that there is a frame there. And so we can talk in this way, using this kind of language, which will be unfamiliar to you initially, but eventually will become natural to you. That nature is not a collection of things, but nature is a matrix of possibilities. A matrix of possibilities, which connotates that the possibilities are always changing. And so the I Ching is actually called the Book of Changes. It's not precisely the Book of Changes, because I in Chinese is the term given to the fourth of a 5-phase energy cycle. The fourth phase is I. And so this is the book of the I. And the I does not mean changes exactly. It means something else. But in order to appreciate what that something else is, what the I is, we need to look briefly at the 5-phase energy cycle. The first phase is Tao, the zero base. The second phase is Te, the one. And the third phase is Zhen, human-heartedness. But it occupies that phase which we would give a designate quality to of 2. Not 2 as a duality, and only in a certain mode, 2 as a polarity. The 2 could also be in a different mode, other than a polarity. They could be a complementarity. And the term, the basic human wise term that includes both 2 as a polarity and 2 as a complementarity, is to refer to 2 as a pair. Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching says, at its deepest, nature is paired. And it means that we are paired in our basic nature. Now, if one gloms onto this and tries to make it some static ascription to man, one can say that man is flawed because he's split. He's split into a subject-object duality, and that this goes down to his very fundamental nature, and therefore he's guilty of original sin. One can make that kind of stupidity. But it doesn't hold at all. For what is actually true and determinable by pragmatic usage is that our basic nature is to have the pairedness real in our basic quality of operation. Man at the deepest level is paired, capable both of polarities and of complementarities, both together, so that polarity and complementarity are themselves a pair of processes, a pair of structures, so that the I Ching recognizes that the five-phase energy cycle, the energy cycle which characterizes the way in which reality occurs, begins with Tao, begins with the zero base, comes into existence with oneness, and that existence has a paired quality which occurs where we are in the energy cycle, right in the middle. Man, in terms of Tao, occurs right in the middle, exactly in the middle. Man's pairedness is the fulcrum upon which the entire energy cycle becomes consonant. When man's pairedness is in tune, the entire energy cycle is in tune. When man is out of tune, the energy cycle is out of tune and will not play to a constant reality, but instead produces chaos, produces the cacophony, the noise, the static, which then yields a confused world. By man tuning himself in his pairedness, there lies the basis of the wisdom of the Chinese. And we will use this at the beginning, as we're using it right now, because this is the beginning. But what we would like to know, we have some appreciation of how Tao begins it. We don't know mysteriously how it begins it, but oneness comes out of zero. Existence comes out of the mystery of this matrix of change. Oneness comes out when a single image of differentiation begins to occur. Putting the finger in the stream. The old Zen saying in 9th century China was, fingers pointing at the moon makes Zen masters laugh. Why? Because man in his primordial submerged ignorance does not notice that the moon is different from himself. Does not notice the moon is different from the earth. When he notices that that's different from me and points with his finger, that's the beginning of the need for an education. It's the beginning of either turmoil if you don't do it right, or eventual consonance by learning how the entire ecology of an education works. So in a way, the Zen master laughs when the finger points at the moon, because it's the beginning either of wisdom or of ignorance. You're either going to create a lot of static in your life now, or you will find the ecology of the energy cycle, tune yourself to it, and live consciously in the flow. That's what this education is about, living consciously in the flow. Allowing not just for the finger pointing at the moon, but allowing for a whole range of gestures and languages and realizations and visions and art, science, and all of it to occur and still be woven into the flow, a part of nature. The I Ching is the I, the fourth part of the energy cycle. Tao in the first, zero base. Te, oneness, in the second place. Zhen, human-heartedness, in the third. And in the fourth, I. And in the energy cycle, the I are the symbols in the mind. The symbols in the mind. that when man's Gen is tuned in its pairedness, the mind activates instantly, spontaneously. The I Ching says, heaven suspends its emblems. That's the phrase in English translation. It means that the Taoist natural mind spontaneously has symbols in it. And those are the I. And the first I, the first symbols in the development of the I Ching, the first symbols in Chinese civilization, were trigrams made up of two kinds of lines, one an unbroken line and the other a line that has a break in the middle. A motion that carries through and a motion that specifically halts in the middle. A motion that halts in the middle is symbolic of a polarity. A motion that does not halt in the middle is symbolic of a complementarity. Thus you have the pair. But when you symbolize them, the symbolization in the mind is of a higher order than their occurrence on the ritual level. And so you cannot just pair the broken and the unbroken lines. You can do that in the ritual way, but you cannot do it in the symbolic way. Because the symbol is on a higher order, it takes 3 and not 2. And so you have to repeat one of the lines twice. And because of that, instead of a pair, which occurs on the ritual level, yin and yang, on the symbolic level, you have an 8-fold quality. The pairedness permutes to an 8-fold, the 8 trigrams, which are the basis of the hexagrams of the I Ching. We have a whole year to appreciate how this happens and why this happens. I just lay it out to you so that you can understand that there is a kind of a natural order to this. That 5-phase energy cycle, and I put it on page 9 of your outline, and you can see it for yourself there. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the 5th phase in Chinese was called Li, Li. And generally that's referred to later on after Confucius as principle. One of the great collections of the right way to do things was called the Li Qi, and it was the book of rights, the book of principles of how you do things. But Li, actually in the energy cycle, meant the world of multiplicity. The Chinese phrase for the world of multiplicity was the world of 10,000 things. The Chinese phrase 10,000 things meant everything. If the energy cycle is right, if it begins with Tao, if it manifests Te, if Gen is tuned, the Li will be spontaneous, and the multiplicity of the world of 10,000 things will be all of a piece so that they factor back into Tao without leaving a trace. So that the 5th phase factors back into Tao, and the whole energy cycle simply occurs without any interference whatsoever. The Tao does not change. Te does not change. The Li is dependent upon the I, and the I is dependent upon the Gen. The only place in the energy cycle where there can be a finger in the stream that can disrupt it is where we are. Man occupies the only place in reality where there could be a glitch in the flow of reality. But he also occupies at one and the same time the only place in the flow where one could be conscious of the entire flow. And so the same potential that allows for us to confuse reality is at the same time the way in which reality is knit back together consciously. So that the raising of nature to a higher level, to the level of consciousness, is dependent upon us mastering our ability to cause confusion. We are the ones who cause the confusion in the first place, and we are the only ones who can heal it. It's like the principle of disease. You have to inoculate yourself with a little bit of the disease, and then you won't get the disease. So an education ecosystem like this inoculates us with just a little bit of the craziness and helps us work it through. So at the end of 2 years, we are immune from causing chaos in our own lives and in the lives of others. And in having the ability to take already caused chaos and work it through an energy cycle and weave it back into a sense of reality. And that's what this education is for. Is it good for getting a job? You bet. You can get a lot better jobs if you're together, if you know what to do. Is it good for success? I saw the New Year's Day glowing report from the Crystal Cathedral, Reverend Schuller talking about success for 94. Well, this is success for eternity. Why stop at 94? Why make a down payment with your effort? Why not do it all? I suppose if we broadcast this in the Crystal Cathedral, we'll be sued. But if he would take the course, notice that the I Ching is the book of I, the changes of I, the book of the way in which the I work. So that the I Ching is a book about symbols. It's a book that occurs in the mind, but only occurs in the mind that is natural. Only a Gen that's in tune will have the I pristinely of the quality that one can work with the I Ching. Because the I Ching developed in the very first Chinese who was able to balance his Gen in such a way that the Tao poured through him without any obstruction whatsoever. And the original author of the I Ching, you can say it's Chinese mythology, but in Taoist tradition, is very real. His name was Fu Shi. Fu Shi. And Fu Shi is the dragon man. The long fingernails, the long hair, the long mustache, the long beard, wearing a leopard skin, seated in the old kingly manner upon his seat, and before him are a pair of things. One is a tortoise, and the other are the 8 trigrams drawn in the dust with triadic fingers like this. The tortoise is because of the tortoise shell was the ancient way of Chinese divination. They would throw a tortoise shell in a fire, and the pattern of cracks in the tortoise shell had been gestalted and collected together from time immemorial, and it was a way of divination. The 8 trigrams in the dust were the leap to another order, to a symbolic order. The divination was a ritual order. The trigrams were a symbolic order. And Fu Shi is the Gen, balanced, who bridged from symbol, from ritual to symbol, from the divination to the wisdom tradition. Instead of using a tortoise shell for divination, one used the trigrams for spontaneous recording of the whole spectrum of possibilities that came from a tuned Jen, from a tuned heart. To use a kind of a colloquial American phrase, the clear mind is a spontaneous product of the tuned heart. And we'll see that tuning the heart was, it meant everything, everything, everything to our wise ancestors. When the heart was tuned, the mind spontaneously occurs. When the heart is not in tune, we have to hem and haw, fudge and cheat, become clever, conniving. And that's kind of like an egotistical version of what should be the mind. Notice here that the Tao is not static. And so nature is not static at all. Nature occurs in a flow. Later on, one of the symbols for nature will be mountains and streams without end. The Chinese phrase is mountains and streams without end. That the stream, in a way, will be an image for the kind of movement that the Tao has latent within it. And that the mountains will be an image that complements the stream. The mountains and stream will go together. Which is yin and which is yang? The yin was said to be the valley spirit. And in a way, when you have mountains, then you have the valley. So in a way, the mountains are a yin receptivity for the yang quality of the stream. So that the water has this quality of yang, and the earth receiving the effect of the flow of the water is to make the valleys and thus to allow for the mountains. When the 8 trigrams were first imagined, when Fu Shi first saw the 8 trigrams, he did not see them as symbols. And so the Taoist myth about the origin of the 8 trigrams is not a symbolic statement, but is a mythological characterization of a ritual activity. So that you can see that there is a whole gestalt package which we have to consider together. We have to consider nature. We have to consider ritual. We have to consider nature and doing, the ritual activity. But we also will come to see that bridging ritual activity and symbolic mental activity, bridging those two is another realm of process known as myth, the place where language takes place. And that myth and nature will be like a pair. Both of them are processes. And that ritual and symbol will be a pair. Both of them have an objectivity. What's the objectivity of ritual? Existence. When something happens, something actually exists. What's the objectivity of the symbol? It will be the essence. Essences are objectively real. The whole principle of, say, medicine by Bach flower essences is that essences are just as real. The whole basis of inoculation, by taking just a little bit of a disease, is that the essence has much more effectiveness than the whole ritual existence. This is the principle in which ancient Egyptian wisdom gave us the understanding of how life comes to us. Life does not come to us en masse in some huge oceanic outpouring, but life comes to us by a single ray of the sun carrying a single ankh. For that inoculation of acceptance, by a single ray of light carrying a single ankh, by being able to accept specifically that gift of that ray, that light, that ankh for you, inoculates you against the chaos of the serpent apop and allows for one to be restored to the health of eternal life. And so all that one would carry symbolically is an ankh. You don't need a whole bushel of ankhs. You don't need 2 ankhs, only one. And so the symbol, in a way, that comes out of the spontaneous, clear mind is the healing inoculation against ignorance. And we will see that all we need is just one ray of light. Just one. And the entire mind is illumined and health is assured. Ourselves to receive one ray of light, that takes preparation. Because we're used to a very clumsy, kind of quantitative grabbing for things. We need a lot in order to assure ourselves that we have something. Whereas this whole first year of education is a sophistication, gentle, like a moving stream, patiently carving itself. But after a year, you will see that we have made a grand canyon where before there was just a mud of ignorance. And the vista will be spectacular. Tao is a zero base. And for this, we say, if we're going to designate a value to it, that nature is mysterious. Ritual is the level where existence occurs, myth is the level where experience occurs, and symbol is the level where essence occurs. And so in those 4, that movement of that quaternary, we have the first year of our education. And by taking it in 4 12-week increments, we get this spread of a pair of pairs. A pair of processes, nature and myth, a pair of objectivities, ritual and symbol. And that pair of pairs is the old wisdom way of talking about the square. The stability, the foundation of the square is not so much that it's 4, but that it is a pair of pairs. The stability of a pair of pairs allows for us to realize something that could not possibly happen in a mystical participation of nature as a whole. The realization that could not happen there, but does happen with a pair of pairs, is that there is a power, a higher level, a higher order available than nature. That nature, beautiful as it is, gorgeous as it is, mysterious as it is not the final level of the real. That there is another level of the real, a level which from the natural standpoint one could only characterize as supernatural, transcendent, higher, a higher order, but an order nonetheless. And so the whole second year is the investigation of that higher order. Let's recap and then take a break. We're trying to begin with a pair of books, Thoreau and the I Ching, and we're just carrying them around with us, if nothing else. This education works in such a way that it is independent of whether you do all of the indications or not. Your guarantee for the fact that it works is that you do it. That's your guarantee. It's like a bridge. I'm on the other bank reaching out, and I'm not going to let go. And if you just from your bank reach out, there will be a touching, and you will have it, and it'll be yours. The I Ching, in its basic understanding, has a resonance on our own time with higher mathematics. The whole way in which computers work is by the binary interpenetration of 1 and 0. The binary language of computers. All of that dependent upon the integral and differential qualities of higher mathematics. By the end of the second year, we will be able to talk about that. We will be able to talk about how differentiation and averaging commute. They exchange. That mathematical truth is a disclosure of one of the great secrets of reality, that differentiation and averaging commute means that possibility, the probability of something happening, not being 100%, but that possibility, keeps nature's matrix mysterious. Possibility keeps nature's matrix mysterious. So that there's all the difference in the world, even though it's a minute difference, there's all the difference in the world between a statistical differentiation or a statistical distribution. To use a little mathematical lingo to close out, a statistical distribution is mechanical. It's like a gas. But a statistical differentiation is conscious. It's a power. Commutation is a ritual reciprocity and is the mirror that culture is. But the true origin of differentiation is zero base. Thus, the field of consciousness is a play in the possibilities. Game theory makes for good business, since Van Neumann and Keynes. The same principles that run business today run the game theory about the statistic of possibilities in game theory. To quote The Theory of Games and Economic Behavior by John von Neumann, published by Princeton about a generation ago, in Chapter 7 he begins, "We are now in possession of a general theory of the zero-sum n-person game." And with that statement, modern mathematics was able to develop itself to the level where literally one could go to the moon for the very first time. Just to fudge a little bit and give some of you repeaters a chance, we could never have gone to the moon mechanically. There's no way whatsoever to go from here to there mechanically. Without the phase, process, matrix of possibility, there's no way to even imagine the path that a trajectory would need to take. For the moon is not there, and the earth is not here. They are moving in a fantastic matrix of movement. Not only is the moon moving around the earth, and that ensemble moving around the sun, and the star system spinning within a family of stars, but that whole family of stars is moving in an arm of a galaxy, which itself is spinning within some kind of complex of galaxies. Melville in Moby Dick said of the little cabin boy Pip, who fell overboard one day off the Pequod into the ocean. They finally fished him out, but he was never the same after that. After that, he would pound his tambourine and look mystically at all the crew. Melville said of poor Pip that he went deep enough into the ocean that he saw God's foot on the treadle of existence. We've talked about the structure of what we're doing. In order to keep this from being simply a collection and to allow it to be a sequence, we have a technique which is time-honored, and that is to have some kind of synthesizing thread which we carry through the whole year. And because we're using paired books as our steps, these pairs of books are just like the pairs of feet, the shoes. The books are the shoes which we walk through the first year. We're going to take a walk using book shoes through the first year. And so to help us synthesize and sequence the steps of our book shoes, we have a choice of one or the other, a choice of two books to read patiently through the entire first year. And then the second year, we'll have a choice of two books to read through that year. The books which I have chosen are time-honored journeys because the best synthesizing threads are books about journeys. I'll talk next week about the feminine journey, which is Homer's Odyssey. Don't be fooled that because Homer was a man, that the Odyssey is a man's story. The Iliad is a man's story. The Odyssey is the complement to the Iliad. The Iliad is about the masculine nature unchecked by any relationship to femininity and how it tends to become more and more on edge in a grandeur of a warrior nature until finally it reaches such a brave, heroic fineness that one wrong thing, one insult will break the entire situation. And so the Iliad is Homer's story about the wrath of Achilles, the most gorgeous, heroic warrior of the ancient Greeks, who becomes absolutely incensed that Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek expedition against Troy, should take his favorite bed companion, and he refuses to fight. Let them fight without me. And because of this, his closest, dearest, best friend Patroclus is killed the very day that Achilles is not on the field. And enraged by that, Achilles comes out to kill the killer of Patroclus, the great hero of the Trojans, Hector. And he not only kills him, but he completely maims him. He drags the body around Troy from his chariot to show that he not only is the greatest warrior and able to beat him in a fight, but that he is the most divine warrior of all time and simply could massacre opposition if he wanted to. Achilles as the Superman. But the heroic masculine, uninformed by any relationality with feminine. And the Odyssey is the healing of the Iliad. Because to read through the Iliad, to listen to the Iliad in its full force, is an extraordinarily devastating experience. And the Odyssey was the healing, the journey back through the different femininities within a man, and his healing of himself to bring himself back so that he can arrive home and be home. The ancient Greek understanding, the Homeric Greek understanding, was that none of the warriors who fought at Troy were able to come home again except for wise old Nestor, wily clever Odysseus, and kingly Menelaus. They were the only 3 Greeks out of the thousands that went to Troy who were able to come back home. That men who go through the tragic rage of wrath for years on end are unable to come back to a home life. One of the great themes after World War II was how to come back into society again after such a great, huge struggle. And of course, one of the great tragedies of Vietnam is that so many of the Vietnam warriors were unable to come back home again. The protagonist in Apocalypse Now says that back in Saigon, the film begins. Saigon, shit, I'm back here again. And then when I'm here, I dream of getting out and going home. But when I was home, it was worse. I could only think about how I could get back here. So the Odyssey is about the feminine journey of healing so that one can come back and be real where you live, called the Day of Homecoming. And we'll talk next week more about the Odyssey. Reading the Odyssey for this year, and not reading it like reading it as fast as you can, but I have put the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Odyssey and the other, Moby Dick, by Herman Melville. I've portioned out readings, 3 or 4 pages each week, selected pages, so that in about 20 minutes, somebody could sit down and just 20 minutes a week, read little portions and spread it out over an entire year. Now the masculine journey is Moby Dick. And Melville's Moby Dick is one of the really great works of the planetary heritage which we have. Melville begins Moby Dick. He begins it with a series of etymologies. And in parentheses, under the etymology. And what is the etymology? The etymology is the language that he's going to use. And one of the words he's going to use in his language is whale. And so he gives us what the ancient Hebrew for whale was, what the Greek was, what the Latin was, the Danish, the Dutch, the Anglo-Saxon, showing that this word in all these languages meant something enormous, not just large, but a quality of life that had enormity, enormity, hugeness in the sense of hugeness that it baffled one's sense of trying to figure out what it was. And the enormousness of Moby Dick is that there is a tragedy here so profound, so huge, that it would have been unrecognizable for anyone who had not gone through the journey which Moby Dick is, in order to appreciate how outdistanced man is by the demonic. That the demonic is so horrific, so huge, so profound, that we would all simply give up were we to know its true nature, its true power. And yet, within Moby Dick is this masculine journey that someone who holds no grudge, no fear, is immune from the enormous tidal wave of evil that awaits man in this world. And that in a way, the human being with no fear, with no grudge, with no trying to fudge in terms of his life to gain an advantage someplace, someone who simply goes through the journey is free from those karmic hooks, those complications which evil always throws as grapples into our situation. And so it begins with an etymology. Melville's humor, constantly leavening Moby Dick. His humor is that kind of the humor which men on the open oceans develop. A kind of a salty humor, an acceptance of pain, a laughing at grief kind of a humor. When he delineates the members of the crew of the Pequod, the second mate Stubb, who laughed in the face of dangers, Melville says, was somehow in this the best of us all. His humor is that the etymology is supplied by a late consumptive usher to a grammar school. A tubercular, coughing, hackneyed Ichabod Crane type of a guy who was like a janitor at a grammar school, not a grammarian. And after the etymology comes a series of extracts where Melville extracts supplied by a sub-librarian, somebody really far down in the pecking order. And these extracts are all quotations from whaling voyages, from descriptions of the whale. One of the extracts says that the heart of the whale pumps more blood when it is excited than the fire pumps in London at the London Bridge. That whales are enormous living creatures, that their home is the ocean. And that in a way, man who would wish to be mobile, free, able to live, to navigate an ocean, must come to terms with the whale. The Chinese have a phrase, Dieter Schur, it means snake of the place. It means no one is wiser than the snakes who live in a place. They know everything about a place. The whale knows everything about the ocean. If man is going to be oceanic, if he's going to be planetary, he has to be oceanic. And in order to do so, he has to come to terms with the whale vis-a-vis himself. And that's what Moby Dick is about. And so the very first chapter is called Loomings. Loomings. And it connotates the way in which a sailor understands a storm is coming through the loomings. Instead of the sails billowing, the sails flap. The first sign of a storm is that the sails start to flap. It means that erratic wind pressure is flapping the sails, and instead of wind blowing, it's lashing like a whip. And so a really experienced sailor, when he's out tacking on a beautiful, calm day, and he hears that crack, that flap of the sail, immediately he will start to look at the weather. What's brewing? The Chinese way of describing catastrophe is that there's a wind in the tower. It means on the high places of the city, you notice that a wind is coming up. It's a Chinese phrase that means, by these loomings, we know a storm is coming. When Fuxi designed the I Ching, his mythic way of describing, for the first time, the way that the trigrams came, was to describe a storm, a thunderstorm in the mountains. And the 8 natural qualities symbolized by the 8 trigrams were all stages of a thunderstorm in the mountains. And I will talk about that more next week. But Melville begins Moby Dick with loomings. The first looming is, call me Ishmael. And who was Ishmael? Ishmael is the one orphaned from his rightful patrimony, his rightful tradition. He and his mother are sent out into the desert. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially when my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I account it as high time to get to sea as soon as I can. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. With a philosophical flourish, Cato throws himself upon his sword. I quietly take to ship. And there is nothing surprising in this. If they but knew it, almost all men, in their degree, some time or other, cherish very nearly the same feelings toward the ocean with me. And he ends the chapter on loomings. He begins it with himself in a disquieted, in a neurotic, almost in a finger pointing at the moon, laughingly confused turmoil. He concludes it with the loomings of the phantasmal vision of the whale. He writes it in this way: though I cannot tell what it was exactly that those stage managers, the fates, put me down for this shabby part of a whaling voyage, while others were set down for magnificent parts in high tragedies, and short, easy parts in genteel comedies, and jolly parts in farces, though I cannot tell why this was exactly, yet, now that I recall all the circumstances, I think I can see a little into the springs and motives which, being cunningly presented to me under various disguises, induced me to set about performing the part I did, besides cajoling me into the delusion that it was my choice, resulting from my own unbiased free will and discriminating judgment. You see, one of the great tragedies in Moby Dick is Ahab will say to Starbuck, this tragedy was rehearsed by thee and me 1 billion years before these oceans ever rolled. Melville ends Loomings with this kind of mystical sense of the wind rising because of the whale in his mind. Chief among these motives was the overwhelming idea, the idea of the whale, the great whale himself. Such a portentous and mysterious monster roused all my curiosity. Then the wild and distant seas, where he rolled his island bulk, the undeliverable, nameless perils of the whale. With these and with all The attending marvels of 1,000 Patagonian sights and sounds helped sway me to my wish. With other men, perhaps, such things would not have been inducements, but as for me, I am tormented with an everlasting itch for things remote. I love to sail forbidden seas and land on barbarous coasts. Not ignoring what is good, I am quick to perceive a horror, and would still be social with it, would they let me, since it is but well to be on friendly terms with all the inmates of the place in which one lodges. By reason of these things, then, the whaling voyage was welcome. The great floodgates of the wonder world swung open. And in the wild conceits that swayed me to my purpose, two and two there floated into my inmost soul endless processions of the whale. And midmost of them all, one grand hooded phantom like a snow hill in the air. So Moby Dick begins that way. It costs you all of $9.95. One pizza. By using either the Odyssey or Moby Dick as a thread, what we do is we sequence all of the pairs of books that we use during the first year. We sequence them into steps. This walk of the world's heritage of great and interesting books is a walk through the maturation of the planetary person in an integrating way. And its pair is the simple ability to take a walk from wherever we live and come back home and add one image and take that walk again with that one image and compare the pair of walks that we took and notice that something has changed. Something in us has changed permanently. One of the great philosophers of ancient Greece, Heraclitus, observed we cannot ever step into the same stream twice. By virtue of having stepped into the stream, we have changed that stream permanently for us. The wise thing, the educational wisdom, is to understand that that has happened and not to ignore it, not to sweep it under the rug, not to let it accumulate and become an unattended to unconscious. For the unattended to, regressive, forgotten, repressed, thrown away experiences that are not woven into the fabric of life collect into that stagnant ocean called the unconscious. And there are whales that live there that at the right moment challenge us. And if you're able to be the orphan, unencumbered by reaction to such challenge, you can go free. But not many are blessed in that way. Gandhi called such people Harijans, children of God. They are free because God lubricates a path for them. But for all others, one has to weave the integrity of one's life painstakingly by remembering what has happened, by being conscious of what has been done, and by bringing it together in the form of a life. Because only in the form of a life can there emerge the person whose life that is. The whole first year is to make this tapestry of life visible. And as it becomes more and more visible, as our sequence of steps in this educational ecology, as they go on and we develop this form of life, there's a counter movement. It's like an undertow that can get you if you're not aware of it, if you haven't prepared for it. If you don't understand that you can't swim against it, but that if you swim parallel to shore, you can outdistance it and find your way back. That's the wisdom. Otherwise, you will exhaust yourself in trying to fight the undertow. What is the undertow? The undertow is that as life achieves form, the very fabric which was used to weave life fades into invisibility. And just at the moment where one would have life completely whole, it becomes totally invisible. And so usually people do not complete the form of life at all for fear that by going any further, one is simply encouraging more invisibility. And so they live in a half-formed life, half invisible, and in this 50-50 nightmare, they try to get by. And as time goes by, that compromise becomes tattered and crumbled, and one resorts to more and more artifice to try and convince one that things are just as well as they used to be. But that half-finished life tatters more and more easily, and the invisibility becomes more and more gaps. And in that kind of confusion, human beings become psychotic. There's no need for that whatsoever. Our ancestors were wise enough. They all knew how to weave well enough to get us here. We should know at least to weave well enough to get ourselves home. And that's what this education is all about. When we come to the I Ching, the first thing to disencumber ourselves with is the idea that yin and yang are polarities. All of the commentaries from the jumping to the conclusion west all say yin and yang are polarities. Yin and yang are pair. They are a pair. They're paired. It can mean in one condition, the condition of time-space, that they are polarized. When they work like electricity, positive and negative. They generate, as a positive and negative pole, an electrical quality. And polarities are electrifying in just that way. But they are also complementarities, and complementarities generate not electricity but magnetism. And the magnetism of a complementarity is as important as the electricity of a polarity. And if you think that the polarity is the operative, you will forget all about the complementation. You will not look at the magnetic quality. You will only look at the electrical quality. And you will try to wire life instead of living it. And we've all seen people who are wired. We've been ourselves wired. The wise thing is to realize that the electrical and the magnetic are a pair. They work together. In fact, electrical energy, in a physics sense, has a large share of electricity and a very small share of magnetism. Whereas a magnetic energy has a very large magnetic complement and a very small electrical. They're always together. So that when you look at energy, the electromagnetic energy, it's like the yin-yang symbol There's a little bit of yin in the middle of the yang. There's a little bit of yang in the middle of the yin. There's a spot of light in the tear-shaped dark. There's a spot of dark in the tear-shaped light. And these two together, that Taoist symbol, that yin-yang symbol, indicate that they are paired and can operate, can function in time-space as a polarity with the electromagnetic energy. But they can also operate when time is unhooked from space and time is joined together with energy. Because when you have a time-energy continuum that is not like a time-space continuum, instead of having electromagnetic energy, you have a magnetoelectric energy, which is quite different, and which registers in mathematical equations very much as real as the electromagnetism of time-space. And so while nature admits of a physics of an electromagnetic time-space, it equally admits a magnetoelectric universe of time-energy. And that those two are paired together, and that is what is real. It's hard to follow something like the Maxwell field equations. It's hard to know the mathematics of even 100 years ago well enough to be able to follow this. But it's simple and easy in terms of the I Ching. It's like a little reminder that yin and yang are a pair. And part of their pairedness is that they can pair as polarities and they can pair as complementarities. And when you bring those two pairs together, you get the square in Taoism. One of the sayings was that you can tell a Taoist master because the pupils of their eyes are square. So when you look into their eyes, you look to see little black squares in their eyes. Well, that's not it. It means that when they look out of their eyes, they see this pair of pairs, this polarity, complementarity, pairedness, as functionally operating as the real. Now, Fuxi, who began the I Ching, took it as far as seeing that these 8 trigrams, and we'll talk more about them next week, but that these 8 trigrams fit together in pairs. Pairedness is the most basic of all of the qualities of nature. So that the trigrams did not exist just as a sequence of 8, or a series of 8, or even a matrix of 8, but that they paired themselves together. And the permutations of joining together made 64 possibilities. And so the hexagrams, the 64 hexagrams, are an order, a logical order. They form a set of the real, which is complete in its ability to characterize both the probability of time-space polarities and the possibility of time-energy complementarities. That's saying a mouthful. I'm telescoping a lot into just that simple phrase. It takes a long time to hear that in its fullness. The probabilities of time-space and the possibilities of time-energy are linked together, and where they're linked together, on that plane, on that horizon, where they're linked together, there's a logical set of 64 hexagrams, which are a universal set of that order on that particular level. So profound is the trigram 64 hexagram structure that it is repeated in the genetic code. And we'll talk about that next week too. One can understand the genetic code of late 20th century molecular biology in terms of the I Ching. The structure of the I Ching is logically the same as the logical structure of the genetic code, the very structure of DNA. And we'll talk about that the very first thing next week. Let me recap and just bring it this far. We're trying to launch ourselves on an educational journey that will be as comprehensive as we can make it. Don't be daunted by all the new things that are there. The principle involved in this kind of presentation is this. Before we can learn anything, we have to have a moment of recognizing that we did not know. We have to have a moment of not knowing in order to evoke the juices in us which can digest the unknown into knowing. We have to know that we're hungry before we are ready to eat. And so my whole purpose as a friend, as an educator, is to generate a rich enough, complex enough field of inquiry so that you are continuously ready for nourishment during the whole 2 years. So my educational responsibility is to make sure that the field of inquiry that's being generated is constantly richer than any one or all of you together could ever integrate together at any given time. So I'm constantly outstripping everyone's capacity to integrate as an educational technique. So don't view that as daunting. Just view that as the whale in the ocean. That whale lives in this ocean. My kind of teaching lives in this kind of education. It's at home there. And if you just go along with it, even though you might feel orphaned right now, you'll come through. You will come through. Moby Dick is not after the individual. He's not after Ishmael. His ferociousness is an artifact of the determined intransigence at being alive with any comprehensiveness. When we dig our heels in, when we will not go, and we have already put our finger in the stream, muddying it, when we've already generated chaos, not to go forward, not to weave this in, to wallow in ignorance, this makes a devil out of God. This makes evil where there was none whatsoever. This makes a profound adversary where there was no adversarial need whatsoever. The earliest Semitic usage of language, when referring to the Satan, always used the neuter particle, the. So in the ancient Semitic understanding, it was never Satan as someone, it was always the Satan as something. And the Satan was a neutered person. Neither a man nor a woman, but a neutered person. And was adversarial because it was the blanking out of either man or woman. And it's that blanked out quality of the neutered person that makes an adversary of life itself and becomes adversarial to life itself. This is the very process of the demonic. All of that, that entire complication is a knot that is made out of needless backtracking, needless repression, needless pulling of things into knotted polarities. And the time-honored wisdom way is to learn how to tie slip knots that not only pull free when you pull on them, but pull free to a vanishing so that there's not even rope there. This is the wisdom tradition. But one has to get used to this, used to a reality where the static there-ness of things is able to go away, to fade away, to disappear, and not be threatened by that. The 19th century was a century where the progressive dematerialization of the principles of nature led to a psychotic breakdown, which was the First World War, and the Second World War, and the Cold War. The whole 20th century is a phobic nightmare generated by the 19th century dematerialization of the basis and principles of a previously thought static nature. Hopefully, this generation can wake up. As James Joyce said, history is a nightmare I'm trying to wake up from. It's time to awaken. In the science fiction film Dune, the protagonist is told by his father, soon to disappear, the sleeper must awake. And the hand is held. The hand is the most ancient symbol, not only of that five-phase energy cycle, but in the way in which grasping at the right place with that five-phase energy cycle leads to a dynamic capacity to live. It's as simple as this. In ancient, archaic times, our species discovered that if you hold a length of wood 2/3 of the way back from the point, and you put a sharpened point on the end of that wooden shaft, holding it 2/3 of the way back, you can throw with the human arm that spear with enough force that you can bring down game and bring down prey. If you hold the spear in the center, you cannot get enough torque in your throw, enough oomph in the impact to penetrate the skin of a game and nourish your life. The ego always prematurely tries to grasp the measurement of things in the middle. Those kinds of people never nourish their lives. They never bring home the game. And they always poach on others, like parasites. The wise person understands how to hunt the nourishment. One of the very few specific things that Egyptian engineering mastered was how to find 2/3 of any number, because it was the civilized version of the Paleolithic hunter knowing that you grab the spear 2/3 of the way back. And once that's understood, it's only a small step towards making what's called a spear thrower, where the end of the spear is cupped and held so that you join the entire reality of the spear and put its momentum in addition to the throwing of the spear by the human arm, so that literally with a spear thrower, one not only throws the spear with the power of the arm, but with the whole mass of the spear and its momentum factored in. The impact is not just a little bit more, it's not twice as much more, but it's many times more. It was the first technology beyond fire. And with the spear thrower, archaic man, some 150, 170,000 years ago, stepped up to a new level and realized that for the first time, that there were secrets that could be discovered by matching the hand and the mind and the eyes, braided into an experience questing for new activities. That was the transferring of the powers, transformational powers of fire from out there to the transformational powers of fire in here. Jacob Bernowski in The Ascent of Man, in his series about 25 years ago, 30 years ago, said the hand is the cutting edge of the mind. And when man learned to coordinate his hands, his eyes, and his mind, braided together in an adventuring experience, he slowly raised himself out of this mystical participation with nature where he didn't understand what was going on, and progressively began to understand not only what was going on, but to complement it by making the ritual mysteries that he had erased from drawing himself out of the mysteriousness of nature, by replacing back all of the mysteries that he took away. By increasing his technological capacity, man ritually put them back in consciously. It was this kind of balance that enabled the human species to be characterized as Homo sapiens sapiens, wisdom, wisdom, man. It's doubled because there's an exponential quality to the doubling. Because when pairedness is in a polarity, you have a stability, but when pairedness is turned into a complementarity, you have a doubling capacity, an exponential. And once you have doubled something, that doubling can happen again, and you can raise something to a third power. And that third cubic power was the beginnings of civilization. Because by the time of a third power, by the time man knew that he could cube his capacities, his powers, he knew then that there was an infinite developability to himself. George Gamow, the great popularizer of physics of about 2 generations ago, wrote a book called 1, 2, 3, Infinity. And in between the 3 and infinity, he put a little ellipsis, 3 little dots. Because the logical progression is 1, 2, 3, and then indefiniteness, infinity. And we will see that civilized man was the beginning of the realizing that our possibilities are endless, or to put it in better terms, boundless. The great Renaissance idea was the rediscovery of the ancient wisdom that man is boundless in his capacities. He is infinitely perfectible. What is man's completion? His boundlessness of perfecting himself. Is this beautiful? It is sublime. More next week. Thank you.